Ladies and gentlemen, kicking off the first stop on his world tour, our new president and prophet, Russell M. Nelson! You say you want some revelation, well, here you go.
Greetings, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the weekly Mormon News Roundup, where Jacob Hansen and D-Bays are going to ruminate on the great and spacious beehive. This is July 16th, 2023. This is episode 68. We have Jacob Hansen, the thoughtful saint. He's co-hosting. We have the Australian LDS Tithing is stoking controversy and is in the news once again from the Sydney Morning Herald. BYU steeplechase athlete has won first place in the U.S. Nationals. What's next for him? And Moms for Liberty has gotten into the spotlight, and there's an LDS connection. Cosmo the Cougar, he's got engaged to another man, and we got an update on that. You're not going to want to miss it. And we're going to give you a fascinating analysis of LDS Sunday attendance statistics in the United States and much, much more. If you want to connect with me, I'm at www.mormonnewsroundup.org. You can send me an email to collab@mormonNewsRoundup.org. I'd like to bring onto the program the thoughtful saint. Jacob, how's it going?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, yeah, that's great. Now, your nickname is the Thoughtful Saint there. Where did you get that nickname from? How'd you come up with that?
So it was just, I was trying to think of a good Twitter handle, and I'd already started my Thoughtful Faith channel. I wanted to do something that was, related to faith. And obviously I wanted to go kind of into the maybe more philosophical end of it to a certain degree. And so I thought Thoughtful Faith would be interesting. And then when I was looking for a Twitter handle, Thoughtful Faith, I don't think was available. So the next one was Thoughtful Saint. And so I put it in there, and that's kind of how it all got started. I don't, if you define a saint as a sinner who's trying his best, that's then maybe I fall under that definition of a saint.
Yeah, because Thoughtful Faith, that was already taken by Gina Colvin, right? I mean, that podcast is over now, by the way. It just ended, I believe, about 6 months ago, but that was already taken up, right?
Yeah, so I didn't even know about any of that when I started. I did. So hers is the only difference was it was a Thoughtful Faith, and I found out about that later, and I was like, oh well, mine was called Thoughtful Faith, and I just ran with it and was like, well, I'm already started, so I'll keep going.
So here's your channel here, Thoughtful Faith. Why did you start this YouTube channel? What's it all about? What do you focus on the Thoughtful Saint channel? You got about 10,000 subscribers, significantly more than the humble Mormon News Roundup.
Well, it got started basically as a way for me to express my thoughts and feelings about things related to the gospel. And it didn't really have much of a following. And then I did a debate with some people at Apologia Church. It's a Calvinist church down in Mesa, Arizona. And when I did that, I began to actually get a lot of people that started listening to me. And then I had people who wanted to talk to me, and then I wanted to talk to other people, and it just kind of grew from there. And the purpose of the group or of the channel is really to strengthen existing Latter-day Saints faith in the restoration, in Christ, and basically to further the mission of the church and I try and contrast truth and falsehood. So that's kind of my my goal of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. So when you look at your Twitter account, it seems like your Twitter persona is, I would say, pretty confrontational. Is that deliberate? I mean, some people might even consider you to be a troll. Is that a fair assessment, or what are you trying to do with your Twitter account here?
No, but I'm very hard on ideas. I try and be soft on people, but hard on ideas. And what's going on Twitter, so far as I can tell, is that you have people that are really exchanging ideas with each other, but not it isn't a forum of deep and thoughtful analysis. And so a lot of the times I'll just kind of say, hey, this is a bad idea, and here's why. And I just drop it. And I try and contrast things that are evil with things that are good and righteous. And so sometimes that can rub people the wrong way. And I'm going to just say up front, like, I'm not a perfect person, and maybe there's legitimate critique. And sometimes when you're in a mood one day and, you're laying in bed or bored and you tweet off something you shouldn't say, I may be guilty of that from time to time. So don't hold me totally. I mean, there's a certain percentage of my posts that I would probably just apologize for straight up.
That's fair enough. Now, I watched quite a few of your YouTube. I haven't watched every video, but I watched quite a few of your YouTube channel. And, I watched one of your recent channels here. You had on Division, Confusion. You had Jim Bennett on and with Steve Heinecker. By the way, I've had now all three of you on the program now, both Steve Heinecker, all three of you have now been on the Mormon News Roundup and Live to Tell the Tale. But I have to tell you that, I have to remark, I'm a little bit saddened by the confrontational level of discourse and the lack of I don't know if I could say a lack of Christian dialogue. How do you feel about that episode, which I believe is one of your most popular episodes? How do you feel about that episode and your tone and performance?
So that episode, I was trying to contrast Jim and I's different perspectives because we have very different perspectives. And not only that, I think we're emblematic of two different camps within the church. And so and that was sort of the goal of the interview, was to help people to see that there is a divide here. Now, I tried my best in that interview, and I think I did all right, of staying on the topic of, hey, these are the things that divide us. And I was asking Jim to kind of explain how he arrived at the conclusions that he arrived to, specifically how he arrives at the conclusion that gay marriage is not inherently sinful, that it could be justified, why he sort of expects for the church to eventually change its position on those things. And obviously he was very defensive about that. And so there was a lot of conflict. However, I don't know that I engaged in personal attacks, and I don't have a problem with conflict. I think conflict is necessary at times in order to resolve issues. We don't want to just sit there and hide and act like there aren't real, serious, legitimate disagreements. And I have the goal to get in there and actually expose the nature of these differences, not for the sake of creating differences, but so that we can resolve them, so that we can figure out where we stand. And if we can't resolve them, then ultimately, yeah, there are lines to where, there are some beliefs in the church that, if a person in the church believes in the Trinity and is teaching the Trinity, that's a problem. We do believe things in this church. And because we believe X, that means we don't believe Y. And so we need to understand when, what do we actually stand for as Latter-day Saints? And when you have two people who have very different opinions, there's going to be conflict. But I felt like Jim was much more emotionally elevated than I was in that interview.
Yeah. Now, I believe that you have said in the time past that about your personal life that quite a few members of your family have left the church. I just wondering, is there anything else about your religious beliefs or personal life that you want to share before we hop in the news articles for this week?
I just point people to my channel. I have a series of videos on my story, and a lot of people, it's probably the one that I get the most messages about, have said that my story has helped them immensely. There's 8 siblings in my family. I'm the only one left in the church. Of my 8 siblings, my parents are still active in the church. And that is my story of how I kind of dealt with that, but not just from an emotional thing, but like intellectually, like how do I deal with all of the attacks that you get from every different corner, whether that be the atheists or whether that be evangelicals, and kind of how a system of thought and a process I went through with that to sort of resolve my issues and to really come into a place of really comfortable faith where I am now without ignoring the issues.
Well, we're really grateful that you came onto the program. It's been a long time in the making, so really appreciate you being here. That does bring us to, we always start every one of our Mormon News Roundup episodes with a joke of the week. And we both kind of found this one from the Babylon Bee here. Disney tries to appeal to Angel Studios' Mormon audience with Indiana Jones and the Plates of Nephi. I guess they're going for the Mormon corridor here. Indiana Jones is about to go full Mormon, says Disney CEO Bob Iger. If you can't beat him, join him. And of course, this is a parody account here, but did you watch Indiana Jones, the latest one there, Jacob? Or
I haven't seen the latest one, but I've heard terrible things about it.
And that also brings me to another meme here. Wait, you weren't joking when you asked me to find Zarahemla? No, we weren't joking about that. I run another channel that's called the Mormon Movie Reviews, and there's a very, very interesting Mormon film that was released back by Chris Heimerdinger, the Tennis Shoes Among the Nephites, called Passage to Zarahemla. And that also is a Mormon joke of the week, by the way. If you've never watched that video, that's pretty funny too. And that also, not to be outdone here, we had one last adventure here. We have Hugh Nibley and the White Horse Prophecy. Which movie would you rather see, Jacob? Indiana Jones and the Search for Zarahemla, or Hugh Nibley and the White Horse Prophecy?
I'm a Hugh Nibley guy, man. I love Hugh Nibley, so let's go with that.
Yeah, I watch either one, definitely. Now, our first news article for the week here is a BYU runner here, Mr. Kenneth Rooks here. He made national news here. He was in the U.S. Championship he runs the steeplechase. He's a BYU. He's currently a junior attending school. And, he's thinking about going professional, but he crossed the finish line to win the men's 3,000-meter steeplechase during the final of the U.S. Track and Field Championships in Oregon just a couple of days ago. He's got a bright future here. And, this is, I just want to play one clip here. What's very remarkable about about his particular run here is that he actually falls in the middle of the run here. You can see him, if you're watching this on YouTube, he actually falls. And then he manages, even after falling, to still win first place and take home the trophy. He's thinking about going into the Olympics. This is a very inspiring story here. What do you think, Jacob?
Yeah, I saw the video. It was kind of making the rounds on social media, and it was super impressive. I mean, I don't care if you're a Latter-day Saint or not. Like that's an inspiring thing to watch someone fall and kind of like, oh, that count that guy out, and then have him come back and win it. Like everybody loves a good comeback story.
Yeah, they certainly do. And, it's got pictures of him crossing the finish line. And he says that it's, his faith really helped him propel. He said, he said, I want to get the quote here right. He said, I guess that the Lord was looking out for me and helped me prepare because, the top couple of finishers here all finished within about 2 seconds of each other, which, falling in an 8-minute run, that's a pretty serious misstep there. But, he persevered. He took it down, and he's preparing here to go to maybe the Olympics. He doesn't even know for sure if he's going to go back to BYU. Very inspiring story. And it just shows to me that, you can do anything you put your mind to. And also the fact that I need to get into better shape. That's without question.
I was going to say one thing on that as well. When you see Latter-day Saint athletes who do well, or Latter-day Saints in any public role excelling in a way that is admirable, it is a way of sort of building the kingdom, because I think people can get this idea that Latter-day Saints are sort of these recluses that hide away in Utah and never interact with the real world. And when Latter-day Saints go out into the world and demonstrate high levels of character, it reflects well that we are people who want to be in the world but not of the world. And I think that's very attractive.
Yeah, without question. Now, another article that caught our eye here for this week was a judge awards $152 million to ex-LDS members in lawsuit against Warren Jeffs. So the plaintiff's attorney calls this award highly symbolic, but says it sends a clear message about abuse. What's interesting about the absolutely horrific Warren Jeffs tragedy is the fact that he is actually up for parole here, and it's only about 10 years from now. And what this particular lawsuit says is, no matter if he does eventually get out of prison, and I think it's he's up for parole in 2038, I believe that it is. Even if he does make it out of prison, that this judgment will stand against him, and he will remain penniless for the rest of his life. And I, for one, am glad to see that there will be some justice for these people if Warren Jeffs does come out. Because the last thing I think that anyone wants to see is if Warren Jeffs is paroled in 2038, if he goes back and takes over the FLDS church, which is worth hundreds of millions of dollars and has the ability to control those assets again, the last thing that we would want to see is him living a comfortable life after the wake of destruction that he's incurred. And this particular lawsuit is going to basically prevent that. What are your thoughts on this one, Jacob?
Yeah, I think justice should be done against a horrible abuser like him, as it should be. I have absolutely zero sympathy for him or for anyone who engages in abusive behavior like that. And in addition, I do say that we got to be careful that people don't leverage this to, do similar things because obviously what he did is a horrible thing of abuse. But if a person engages in, nowadays abuse can be defined as so broadly that, that the church, our church or any church could be sued for some sort of abuse. You know what I mean? We do also have to be careful of religious liberty, but there is a level to which obviously, like if you're in violation of just laws, which are just laws like the ones that he violated in the things that he did, that there need to be as harsh of consequences as we can think of in relation to those crimes.
Well, it's interesting that you say that you wouldn't necessarily want to see a wider application of this, because we have seen a wider application of cases like this. For instance, just in April, there was a lawsuit that happened in Riverside, California, where this is a single case. This was not a class action case. This was a single case of abuse in which the plaintiffs were awarded $2.3 billion for a single case of abuse. So, yeah, we have seen these are, again, very symbolic type of lawsuits that happen. Is anyone going to be able to get $2.3 million for a single case of abuse? Probably not. Are they going to be able to get $152 million out of Warren Jeffs? Probably not. But we're seeing these type of symbolic actions take place in the court, and it's becoming a lot more frequently. It seemed like you were thinking that was a bad idea.
Yeah, well, we have to be careful to make sure that the parties accountable are held accountable. And there are definitely interests in the world to go after the church as the party responsible for these sorts of abuses. And we have to be very, very mindful that that people are to be held accountable for their sins and not to loop people into groups and hold groups of people accountable, to where us as Latter-day Saints, because some Latter-day Saint or so-called Latter-day Saint goes off the rails and does something horrible, that suddenly we all essentially get punished as a church and as a people. And so we gotta, like, we're in an age where words are losing their meaning, and abuse can be super broad, and then you hold groups accountable instead of individuals. And so in this environment where on one hand I'm like, yes, Warren Jeffs needs to be punished for the things that he's done and his crimes, at the same token, I wouldn't even want to punish every member of the FLDS church. I would want to punish Warren Jeffs, because he's the one who actually committed the crime. And so within the framework of the law, we have to be very, very careful that we don't get into collective notions of justice. And instead, what we should do is what the American tradition, what the church holds, that individuals are accountable for their actions.
Yeah, I know one thing is the fact that since the value of Ensign Peak is now widely known, that it's in excess of $100 billion. And even David Bednar, he didn't deny it in the National Press Club briefing last year when he was asked about it. And that doesn't include the church's real estate holdings. People now know how much the church is really worth, and it's worth, a tremendous sum. So we, in my opinion, we're more likely to see these incredible, truly, I want to say exorbitant sums for some of these incredible abuse cases. That's not to say that, somebody wasn't abused and they should deserve a recompense for it. It's most likely this $2 billion judgment is going to be reduced down to a more reasonable level. But you're going to see, it's not just about the individuals. They're going to say you suffered individually, but then it's the punitive damages that are associated with these court cases. And now that the church's valuation is well known, the punitive damages, you're going to see them going higher and higher.
Yep. And now you might understand why the church has an incentive to try and keep its financial holdings maybe less publicly known, so that way you avoid becoming a target for every lawsuit. Because the first thing you learn about lawsuits and lawyers is they look at how deep the pockets are of the person that they're trying to sue. If you don't have deep pockets, they don't sue you. If you do, they do.
Yeah. And that's one of the difference between the spotlight scandal with the Catholic Church, is that the individual Catholic dioceses are generally incorporated on their own, and they're worth a certain amount. So when you're suing the Catholic Church, you can't sue the Catholic Church in totality. You can only sue your individual diocese. Whereas the church, it's not, your stake is not worth anything. Your stake owns nothing. You can sue the church as a whole, as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, not your individual diocese. And the church is worth a lot more than any individual Catholic diocese. But this is not the biggest, speaking of the biggest paydays, the biggest Mormon lawsuit of all time is not the $152 million with LDS. It wasn't the $2 billion that we just saw in Riverside. It's actually $4.6 billion that happened last year, where a Mexican cartel went down and wiped out, unfortunately, this is a horrible killing here, 9 women and children, a Mormon offshoot community. They sued the drug cartel and were awarded a whopping $4.6 billion. So yeah, we're in the age of litigation, and we've seen some truly massive payouts that have happened. Our next article here is the Moms for Liberty here. And this was very interesting. It was tweeted out here by the Deseret News here just a couple of days ago on July 7th, 2023. It says, who are the Moms of Liberty and what are their goals? And the head of the Moms for Liberty is Tiffany Justice, who says that the media coverage of her group hasn't been fair or accurate, and that they should not be designated as an extremist group. Now, I know you read this article here. What is your take on the Moms for Liberty and the church, and it appearing in the church, Deseret News, in coverage?
Well, I feel like this group is being abused terribly. Like there was this whole thing about them quoting Hitler, and there being this whole hullabaloo, and they're a hate group because of that. And I looked at the actual quote, and it was a quote from Adolf Hitler that just said, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." And it was obviously what they were doing, is anyone who knows anything about the context of all of this, is they're saying, look, the government is trying to own our children. And that was the same idea that Adolf had. And so they weren't quoting Hitler to promote him. They were saying that, look, the government, just like Hitler did, these people are trying to take your children. They're trying to claim that the state has a greater ownership over your children than you do as individual parents. And so my thing is, there's all these accusations of being a hate group and all this stuff, like the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you know what? When I watch the Southern Poverty Law Center make these sorts of claims, all it does is discredit them, because that's a joke. Like, what are you talking about? They haven't brought anything substantial to the table to validate these claims. You're just name calling people. That's what we do now. It's horrible. And as I've looked into the group, I've I don't know a ton about it, but what I've seen, I've very much agreed with. And, so I'm more looking like why does anyone have any problem with this group? And every time I've seen anything they brought up, it's just distortion and lies. And it's just an obvious bias and agenda by joke organizations, in my opinion, like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which no one should even care what they think, because frankly, they're so full of it and they're so unreliable in the groups that they call hate groups that I don't know why anyone cares what they think.
Yeah, I mean, this Moms for Liberty, as I was reading the article, they got their start in Florida in 2019 with the fight against the Florida COVID safety measures. And I did look up and I said, I don't want to base my opinions on any group on any one particular center, even if it is Southern Poverty Law Center. So I looked it up on thehill.com, which, by the way, thehill.com, they're right-leaning. They said 6 reasons that Moms for Liberty is an extremist organization. I looked it up on NPR, and it says Mom for Liberty is an extremist organization. So I got the right-leaning, I got the left-leaning. They all seem to be in agreement that this is an extremist organization, as well as the Southern Poverty Law Center. There seems to be a wide consensus about the nature of this particular group. And I find that to be remarkable.
You're wondering why. I haven't seen anything, and maybe they are. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe I just haven't done enough research. But that's the thing, is we live in this age of making accusations without getting specific. So why specifically are they an extremist? Because today's extremist, there are these terms now that people use that, like, if you think that you're a man and a woman, that there are only 2 genders, you're suddenly an extremist. So I always take all this with a grain of salt. But like I said, until I hear the specifics as to why, extremist doesn't mean anything to me, because it all depends on who's calling you an extremist.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Southern Poverty Law Center. So here's some of the groups. I believe there's 77 groups that the Southern Poverty Law Center says are either hate groups or extremist groups. The Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, the National Vanguard, that's a neo-Nazi group. The Euro group, which publicizes David Duke's group. Blood and Honor, which is another neo-Nazi organization. Aryan Nation is a white supremacist. Jewish Defense League is anti-Jewish. The Brotherhood of the Clans. They're not, Jacob, they're not saying just some random citizen who thinks that there's only 2 genders does not make this list. This list is populated by people who are pretty bad. There's not 3 million groups in here. There's 77. So if you're making this list, I don't know. I do trust the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Obviously, some of those groups are not only extremists; they're just abhorrent monster groups. But frankly, they're really, really small groups that don't have much power or sway at all. You go into some trailer park in Kentucky, you can find some nutcases. My bigger thing is who has power, and also this group that they're mentioning, the Moms for Liberty. Okay, let's get specific. What have they done that's so extreme?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen anything.
I just wonder, do you think that this is the type of organization that Jesus was joining? And that's why the reason that I'm asking that is this an organization that the church should be giving a platform to? For instance, should the Deseret News run softball interviews with the founder of the Proud Boys or for the Anti-Defamation League? Should they run, because this is a pretty softball interview on it, should they be doing it for those type of hate groups to get their message out? Or should we not be doing that? What do you think?
I don't presume that they're a hate group. I haven't heard anything about them that would make me think that. So I can't comment until someone shows me that these people have done something that is somehow so beyond the pale that we can't talk to them.
Okay, now our next article is on cell phone data. So a very interesting researcher, Devin Pope, he got a hold of 2.1 million cell phone logs, and he used that information to track where people were going, because it has the GPS location on it, on where they're going on Sunday worship days. And he published this onto Twitter here, which is really, really interesting. It's in the process of being peer reviewed. But if we took a look at religion in America in general, about 30 million people, 25 to 30 million people go to church on any given Sunday, and he can use the triangulation in the GPS to figure that out. And he also broke it down because he knows where the locations of Protestants are. He knows where the location of Catholics are, and whether, there's about 5 million Catholics who go to church on Sunday. And obviously, very important for me, he also got the data for the Latter-day Saint, the Mormons. And this was really, really interesting because it tracks that during general conference times that obviously people are not going to church. So that's why it's so low. Only maybe very, very small amount. And Latter-day Saints, only has a small peak on Christmas and Easter, which is what one would expect. But this is very interesting because it looks like on any given Sunday for about the last, this is for the time frame of 2019 to 2020, about 1.4 million Latter-day Saints go to church in the United States on any given Sunday. How do you feel about the accuracy of this, considering the fact that I believe the church boasts, I want to say 6.8 million members in the United States? What do you think about this? This is an interesting take here.
Yeah, so I actually did an analysis myself, just kind of off the cuff. It's nothing crazy scientific, but I researched what the total numbers were because you researched Latter-day Saints, Protestants, Jehovah's Witness, Catholics, and Jews, and some other groups as well. But I just mainly focused on those. And what they found was, okay, what percentage of them are active on a weekly basis, right?
Mhm.
And that's different from the church's standard of activity. The church's standard of activity is, I think, once a month. If you're attending at least once a month, then you're considered active in the church.
I think that's right.
So this puts us at about 21% based on those numbers.
Yeah.
Which to my understanding is roughly, I would say that feels about accurate if you're going on a weekly basis. It'd be higher than that if you're just doing it on a monthly basis, obviously. But then now let's compare us to other groups. Protestants, so we're at 21%. Next, that's the highest of the group, just so everyone knows. We came out the highest according to my data that I saw. LDS were 21%, Protestants were 16%, Jehovah's Witness were 11.5%, Catholics are 6%, and Jews are 2.4%. So our activity levels are actually much higher than the title could read, Latter-day Saints are the most active religious group or large religious group in the country, according to this data. So that's one way of looking at it. The other is saying, oh my gosh, only 1 in every 5 Latter-day Saints are attending weekly worship services. To anyone who's been around the church long enough knows that there's high levels of inactivity in the church. There are many people get baptized that don't ever actively participate in the faith. So you have a lot of that. But I also would say that that kind of goes along with the Pareto distribution of, the 80-20 rule, as they say. 80% of what happens in an organization happens by 20% of the people in it. So that's another way of kind of looking at it. So these numbers don't surprise me so much. And comparatively speaking, in a world where religion is in decline throughout the country, to still have to be at the top of the heap of the people that are religiously active is I think a compliment.
Yeah, definitely. And he also, somebody, he tweeted out, as far as, because this is only just taking a look at any given Sunday, he says, well, what is the LDS activity rate in the United States as a whole? And he came up with this. He said, on any given Sunday, about 1.4 million Mormons or Latter-day Saints go to church. But of course, some people are sick, some people are on vacation, some people are at home and they are very, very active, but get the sacrament at home. So he said, well, what is the true activity rate? Well, he says that it's about a 30 to 35% retention rate. And I think the LDS Church has ever claimed that retention rate is much higher than that. In fact, I'm a bit surprised by how high it is. And quite frankly, I was a bit surprised overall at the retention rate and the activity rate. As you mentioned, I think it's a positive sign.
Yeah. No, I think that one of the things that's going on in our age of social media is that people, we now know what everybody's doing. Back in the day when somebody went inactive, they just like, oh, well, they aren't coming to church anymore. You didn't see them. Now they're on Facebook and they find other ex-Mormons and they all, commiserate together and create groups. And so it may seem like there's something new happening. I think to some degree there is. I mean, our growth rates have slowed. We are facing challenges, but I think we got to be careful that we don't, these people out there, oh, the church is just hemorrhaging members. And it's like, I think that some of that is perception. And whenever you look at the data, it does appear that obviously the church is facing its challenges in a secularizing society. But I don't think that the church is, hemorrhaging like some people would make it out to be. And these stats seem to support that.
What I would say is one more thing is that this tracks cell phone data. And because Latter-day Saints typically have larger families than Protestants and larger families than Jehovah's Witnesses, not all of those kids are going to have a cell phone, right? So if you're only tracking cell phone rate, the numbers could be slightly worse for Latter-day Saints when comparison to other religions because of the nature of the cell phone usage. Then on the other hand, some of the Latter-day Saints tend to live a lot longer than other people too. And your 80 and 90-year-olds, they don't always bring their cell phones to church. So he actually said that it might be a wash. Obviously, this data is imperfect. It's just cell phones. But I think we gained a lot of valuable knowledge from it. I think you brought a very good take on it. Now, our next article here, this was in the news, and my banner is actually wrong on this because I said April Despain starts a GoFundMe, and you corrected me that no, she did not start a GoFundMe. But she is back in, she's in the spotlight. What's going on here, Jacob?
So April Despain, should I go into talk a little bit about her story overall or just this latest developments?
Can you sum it up in 30 seconds and then give us the development?
Sure. So April Despain, for Pride Month, decided to put up a family proclamation in her yard as a way of her expressing her views on gender and sexuality, since everyone else was putting up their pride flags for expressing their views of gender and sexuality. And so there are people obviously who didn't like this very much. Apparently, April has also been very active in, she's noticed things in her local school district that her kids were being taught that had to do with gender ideology and stuff. And so
she homeschools. She homeschools.
But she didn't originally. She switched to homeschooling because her children were exposed to some of the stuff, and she basically lost faith in the local school district. So she's had tension between herself and the local school district for quite some time. So she pulled her kids out of the school district, and she has continued to kind of be a public advocate for parents who don't want this kind of stuff in schools. And it drew the ire of the PTA president and others. And apparently, according to the story, the PTA president sent multiple people to place pride flags in her front yard, which was like, what? So then now she basically called her out, and they got into this online spat. And what essentially has happened is now, apparently, according to the story, the PTA president, who was already threatening, like, hey, we're going to sue you, is now trying to threaten and sue April for basically standing up for herself online, so far as I can tell. And I haven't seen anything illegal that April has done. I'm no expert on these sorts of things, but so far as I can tell, she hasn't done anything that I would convict her on.
No.
And so she's now raising funds to help fight this legal battle where she's being sued for, I think it's stalking or defamation or something like that.
Yeah, the thing about it, I just want to say one thing. The last I heard, there's only a threat of a lawsuit. An actual lawsuit has not been filed, to my knowledge, and I've been trying to watch the space as carefully as I can. So, I don't know. It's one thing to raise funds for defending a lawsuit. It's another thing to raise money for the threat of a lawsuit, because we live in a pretty litigious society, and threats of lawsuits are a dime a dozen, especially to public figures. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I'd encourage people to go and to look at April Dispense. It's on what's called givesendgo.com/April Wild with an E on the end Despain. This is her full explanation of what's going on here. And she does say that any money not used will be transparently donated to charity. So she's basically said, I'm putting together a legal defense fund. I don't know. I'd have to review it if there actually has been legal action filed. I believe there was something, but yeah. So if she's going to be donating this money, she basically is trying to protect herself.
That's what I'm wondering. Okay, so you said you need the money for the legal defense, and that I understand. But then if you're donating the money to charity, then you're just donating the money to April, who's going to donate it to charity. Why don't we just donate to charity and eliminate the middleman? That's what I don't understand.
In my mind, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. If she is legitimately being filed, it says, I think there's an injunction that was filed against her or something like that. That's the thing is, and if it says in her thing, it says, now the PTA president is attempting to silence me again by filing a civil stalking injunction against me.
Yes, and that civil stalking injunction that was leaked, and now this is all just a rumor. I don't have this for certainty, but the stalking injunction was granted as April was the stalker and not the PTA president. It was reversed from what we seem to be told. Now it's only from leaks, but yeah, I mean, so
April, so far as I know, April had said that that it was filed against her as though April were the stalker.
Yeah, and then it was granted. The judge granted the injunction, the stalking injunction, which says that there's going to be no contact. So she was the stalker, not the other way around.
Yeah, according to the judgment of the judge, but I haven't seen anything that April has done except for defend herself against people that have been putting pride flags in her yard and like calling her names and harassing her family. And I'm sure it goes both ways. The supporters of April are going to go and say terrible things and whatever. But and fine, if y'all need to break it up and calm down, and that's what the judge wants to do, like fine. But if there is something legal that's going to happen here beyond just this injunction, and with that injunction being filed against her, if there are costs associated with that, I would encourage people to support April, to actually donate to her, because I think what's happening to her is totally wrong. And she's not, so far as I've seen, she's not done anything wrong. She's very adamant in her opinions about things, but to have legal action taken against her, I think is pretty insane. And as someone who has had sort of frivolous legal threats and things against me, if you're an ordinary person, I'll tell you that is terrifying when you have someone with deep pockets saying, I'm going to make your life miserable. And by the way, they can do it. You can literally do nothing wrong in this country, and you can have someone financially wreck you if they're willing to spend some money on their end just to do that to you. So in this case, I haven't seen her do anything wrong. And if she's saying that she's going to donate this money and you trust her and you support her cause, then go ahead and donate it to her. And I would be supportive of that. I don't have any problem with it.
Yeah, this isn't the only LGBTQ item that has appeared in the news, and we do have an update here because we covered this a couple of weeks ago. Ben Shalati, as Charlie the Cougar, Charlie Bird, and Ryan, they've gotten engaged here, and Ben Shalati released a blog post that he gave his thoughts on it. And what did he say, Jacob?
Well, my issue with what's going on here is basically Ben is talking about Charlie and his now fiance. And about attending their wedding, okay, and kind of what he feels about their decision. He says that basically, and I'll read some of it. He says he knows how much they love each other, how much they love the gospel of Jesus Christ, and how hard they are working to live the best life they can, given their incredibly difficult circumstances. The more, and he says, the more I feel confident in them and their decisions. So he's not in any way pushing back against their decision to get into a same-sex marriage and sexual relationship. He says I can honor, respect, and support them, even if my choices look different. So here's my thing. I have a gay brother, and if my gay brother were to get married, I actually would attend the wedding. But I would not write an article like this saying that, I honor it, I respect it, I support it as though I support this union in full in any way. I'd have to make a very clear distinction that even if I were to attend and be supportive and show love for my brother, that I do not consider that union a marriage, because marriage is defined by God as the union between a man and a woman. And to have someone who is a BYU, I think professor, I believe he worked in the honor code office in the past, writing, and a published Deseret book author who gives courses on how to be an ally, to have him essentially say, look, like, yay for this. It's by our doctrine and by our teachings, this is not a marriage. A marriage is the union of a man and a woman. And so for him to basically just in this article, just give the full big hug to it without mentioning anything about why this isn't right, it creates confusion in the church, is what it does. And we are a confused people. We know we need to show love to our gay brothers and sisters. Everyone pretty much that isn't crazy can agree on that. But what does that look like? What does that translate into? And this, in my mind, just looks like tacit approval of it. If anything, it puts the church's policies as kind of like, well, because I'm a member of the church, I got to kind of be like, I'm not going to make the same decision as them, but this is great. This is wonderful. I honor it. He said, I got my tuxedo already. And, I'm just happy for them. This is wonderful, and it gives the wrong vibe. It doesn't have enough clarification. It gives the love, which I'm a favor of, like I said, but it doesn't give the law. And you have to have both, because otherwise we essentially imply that the law doesn't matter or that we don't believe it.
So are you saying that you would like to see a membership cancel today, immediately?
For Charlie?
Yeah.
I think that, yes, I think if you are entering into a gay sexual relationship, that at the very least, the leaders of that person should talk with them, counsel them against moving into a same-sex relationship, and and then if not, that their records should be removed from the records of the church. You can't have Latter-day Saints that are gay married, in my opinion. Now I do want to say this though. Obviously, that judgment call is left up to local leaders, but this is where there's a problem. I've been on membership councils multiple times during my service in the church. I've been in bishoprics. I was a branch president during my mission. I've been around this kind of stuff. And the thing is, I've been on multiple of these for people who have entered into same-sex or who have had same-sex relations in one way or another, in one instance or another. And the question is what do we tell those people? Do we now tell them that, oh, well, if you're a big enough name, if you're a really big name, very popular Cosmo the Cougar type that has a book in Deseret book, you don't have to worry about membership councils anymore. You can do whatever you want, because that the special people in the church, they get to do what they want. But the rest of you have to face the consequences. Because if I was in a membership council with someone who had broken the law of chastity by engaging in homosexual relationships, what would I say to them if they looked at me and said, why am I here in this membership council? And while people like Charlie Bird are not. If we're not consistent in the way that we follow the policies of the church, then it ends up being like some people get special treatment. And that's a big problem.
Well, I'll just say one thing. Charlie's books are not in Deseret Book. They mutually agreed to pull them out of Deseret Book a few weeks ago. And
But
with regards to
they were in Deseret Book, though.
Sure. Yeah, they were in Deseret Book, but they aren't anymore. But you talked about homosexual behavior, but even according to the church's handbook, homosexual behavior is not grounds for an immediate membership council. There are 11 points in which are, and that's not one of them. The ones that require a membership council is murder, rape, sexual assault, conviction, child or youth abuse, abuse of a spouse or another adult, predatory behavior, incest, child pornography, plural marriage, serious sin while holding a prominent church position, and most felony convictions. So in your hypothetical example of the one person who said, why am I having a required membership council? I would say follow the handbook, because it doesn't say homosexual behavior requires membership council.
Well, I would maybe go back one to that list, if you can pull it back up real quick.
Sure.
One of them is serious sins
while holding a prominent church position.
While holding a prominent
which Charlie Burt does not hold, nor Ryan either.
Well, there's two things. These are the ones that require a membership council. Like there is no option of if it were to need to be held. But a serious sin, first of all, do we agree that engaging in homosexual acts is indeed a serious sin?
Well, I just go according to the church handbook. It says serious sin while holding a prominent church position. Charlie Burt, as Cosmo the Cougar, that's not an ordained position. He doesn't hold a prominent church position.
And maybe so,
Ryan
but
doesn't either.
If someone in the church, regardless, I would say that a person who is engaging in homosexual acts publicly as a prominently well-known Latter-day Saint, you de facto don't hold an ordained position, but I would consider that something that would be a factor to consider. Now, keep in mind what you had pointed out in the handbook are the cases where it requires a membership council. Okay. So my thing is then if we were to look at the other ones where it's not required, but that it may be necessary. Do we have that list to look at?
Yeah. There is other aspects that says 32.6.2.5 that says that there's some aspects where a membership council may be necessary. And so membership council may be necessary for attempted murder, sexual abuse, adultery, fornication, cohabitation, civil unions, and same-sex marriage. So in those cases, yes, it may be necessary, and it's up to the discretion of the stake president.
Yeah, and it is at the discretion of the stake president. So the question is why is it that some members are going to have this be given and others not? And especially when I'm going to assume he's temple endowed. I'm not sure. But if you have someone who hasn't been active in the church for 25 years, they live, and they're not in any way even active in the church. Do you need to have a membership council because you found out through the grapevine that they engage in same-sex relationship? That may be a different scenario. But if you have someone who is well known, who is known as a Latter-day Saint, who is out there active online with a large following, who has members of the young women's presidency, interacting with him, and then this person is now engaged in a homosexual same-sex marriage, that seems like a different situation to me. That seems like one that it's more serious here, and that we need to that in my opinion would. Now it's left up to the stake president. I'm not here to challenge the specifics of the stake president, but the question is we have to have some guidelines under which you would think that this is reasonable to have this sort of thing. And in my judgment, we need to make sure that people know that homosexual relationships are seriously sinful, and that you can't participate in the church without any sort of restrictions if you're out engaging in homosexual behavior, whether you call it a marriage or not. It's simply not something that can be allowed in the church, because it will normalize the behavior to where this will eventually be something that we don't consider sinful. And that's really what's at the root of this. That's what I tried to point out with Jim Bennett. People don't think homosexual behavior is seriously sinful. They just don't. And so and maybe that stake president thinks that. He just thinks it isn't a big deal. And is it the case? I think that violates the scriptures. It violates what our prophets have taught. It violates our doctrine of the family. And we have to make sure that when public figures in the church are flaunting this right in front of everyone's faces, that the church puts down a foot to avoid confusion, because otherwise everyone will sit there and not know what the church really stands. And then there are those in the church that think, don't worry, give it 20 years, the church is going to change its policies and doctrines.
Yeah, for our listeners out there, we're on YouTube. If you could let us know your thoughts on Charlie Bird and his upcoming marriage, we'd be very, very grateful for that. While you're at it, drop us a like, drop us a subscription. We'd be very grateful for that too. We just got a couple last articles to get through this week here. You brought this one up as well for us, Jacob, and it's the Book of Mormon and Elder Corbett, who's really, in my opinion, one of the rising stars of the church here. He was just, if you want to say, promoted in the last General Conference. That's a simple term. I know some people don't like it, but he said he went to the Better Angels Conference here, and he talks about how the Book of Mormon warns against division at the Braver Angels Conference. And why did you find this a good article to discuss this week here, Jacob?
Well, because I believe in the message that President Nelson taught about unity in the church. And I think that these sorts of things of outreach to try and engage with those who are willing to try and have conversations and find unity, I think these are good things. However, I also want to offer a critique to it. So let me just read something from the article. It says Elder Corbett, I'll just read directly from it. It says Elder Corbett cited addresses from President Oaks and President Eyring of the church's first presidency. The former encouraged to, quote, moderate and unify on contested issues, and the latter emphasized a great day of unity is coming. And Elder Corbett in his speech at this conference says, let us imagine the consequences of not heeding today's calls or of not earnestly pursuing the inspired objective of this convention. Elder Corbett concluded, as we lead with courage and boldness while exemplifying kindness and hope for the soul of America, we can together fix the eye of the nation on an inspired vision of our future as a people and as a more perfect union. Love this. However, there's something missing in all of this conversation. Unity is only possible when there is something that people unite around. And that's what we need to discuss. And that's what we need to basically, that's the whole thing. What are we uniting around? Because if we don't have something that we unite around, then there will be nothing to unite us. And the real question is in the broader country, is there, what is it that unites all Americans? Genuinely. And I feel like those things are becoming smaller and smaller, but even within the church, right? Again, that, we were talking about in that last article, if we don't stand for something, if we don't have okay, homosexual behavior is wrong and immoral, then what do we believe? Right? And if you have a house that's divided with different groups and different beliefs, you're going to have division, you're going to have conflict. The way to resolve the conflict is with truth, and that everyone needs to embrace the truth. Because you can't have people who all have these different beliefs hold together as a coherent people, either within the United States or within the church, without having some sort of a greater unifying principle that we all unite around.
Yeah. Let me ask you a pointed question then. Does your Twitter profile and YouTube personality, do they encourage unity or do they breed division?
They encourage unity around the gospel of Jesus Christ. Christ himself knew that he would bring division. The truth does tend to divide people. But the thing is he said, those who have ear, let him hear. He basically was saying, look, the people who want the truth, they'll come on board with what I'm saying. If we try and just placate what everyone else says without trying to actually speak the truth, we will not get unity. Unity can only be found in the truth. And that also means that we have to combat lies. Unity, you don't just, this is the thing I can't stand. There's sort of this idea that just say unity, just be really nice to people and everyone will come together. No, you come together when you can actually get people who don't like each other to come together when they're united around some common purpose or goal. Just saying unity doesn't do anything. It's when we actually have some unifying principles. And for Latter-day Saints, who are my target audience, I call them to be united to the teachings and principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that pisses a lot of people off because a lot of people hate those principles. And Jesus Christ was the same way. Jesus did not get crucified because he was being too nice. He got crucified because he spoke the truth. And ultimately, my goal is to be hard on ideas and soft on people. I don't tolerate ideas that are lies, that are falsehoods, and I'll speak out against them.
Yeah, I do want to just address one point where he talks about how the Book of Mormon warns against division. And I was thinking about that this week since you said that this was an important article for you. And it just really reminds me of 2 Nephi, in 2 Nephi, I think it's chapter 25, where we had the Nephites and the Lamanites who separated themselves at that time based upon ideology and practices that the Book of Mormon tells us about. And then God, according to the Book of Mormon, God cemented the division in between these two groups of people by turning one of the skins dark so that they would be loathsome towards each other. That seems like a significant step away from unifying people, is to cement a skin change so that they would be loathsome towards each other. Does not the Book of Mormon, is that not an argument against the Book of Mormon's call for unity?
The call for unity is unity around what? The Book of Mormon doesn't say just unity for the sake of unity. Jesus didn't say unity for the sake of unity. Jesus talks about the goats and the sheep. You're either for me or you're against me. It's all over the scriptures. This is a modern invention of our culture to have this weird idea that there's no division between people. The question is who's on the Lord's side? That's the division. It's the division between truth and falsehood, light and dark. And we invite everyone to come and be united in Christ. And that's the Book of Mormon message. And when Zion is achieved to the degree that it was in 4th Nephi in the Book of Mormon, read it. It talks all about their love and unity in Christ. What happens is because they're united around Christ, unity emerges. But if you don't have Christ, you just have warring factions. Unless you have a unifying principle that everyone is united to, then what holds us together?
Yeah, we're on Instagram, by the way, for the Mormon News Roundup. You want to find us on Instagram, let us know your thoughts. Is the Book of Mormon, does it warn against division? Let us know your thoughts on Instagram. We'd be very grateful for a comment. We got 2 last articles to get through, and we, as usual, we have saved the best for last, or these last 2. And I find this to be very remarkable here. And this is the article here that's written from theconversation.com, and it says, Mormon leaders whose church is often associated with the Grand Old Party push back against one-party politics. So the top leaders of the church dropped a bombshell in June 2023 by telling their flock to vote for Democrats. Is that true, Jacob?
I read this article and I couldn't help but look. It was definitely read between the lines kind of take by a particular author. I found the church has always encouraged its members to vote their conscience, and they took this article and frankly are making a mountain out of a molehill, where the church basically said, hey, y'all get out and vote. The church doesn't have any political endorsements. Make sure you look over your party and all that kind of, or don't just vote straight party ticket, like really look at the issues, all that kind of stuff. And so they interpret it as that, and that's, just so we know, that's kind of, I don't think that's really controversial in the church's history. I think the church has always kind of had that more or less position. The church has never endorsed a political party in particular, and rightfully so, in my opinion. But so this article I felt like was misguided, because the author basically says like, oh yeah, they're just dog whistling, telling them to like vote Democrat now that they just happen to be reminding people to like think about which, choose wisely who you're choosing, which was essentially like what the essence of their message was. It wasn't anything.
Yeah. Let me read this to you. Let me read from this article. It says, merely voting a straight ticket or voting based on tradition without careful study of candidates and their positions on important issues is a threat to our democracy and inconsistent with revealed standards the church's top 3 authorities wrote, referring to Latter-day Saint scriptures. So there seems to be, if I'm going to read between the lines here, Jacob, this seems like a not so veiled shot at Donald Trump. Am I just way out of line, or?
I don't think, what I think the church leaders definitely have issues with certain policies of Donald Trump. I also think they probably have policies of Donald Trump that they strongly support. And I think that is probably, and I think that most people are that way. And so whether it's directed straight at Donald Trump or whether it is, again, there's a lot of reading between the lines here. And I think what the church is saying is what it's always taught, is be wise in who you're choosing. There's more than just the presidential election at hand. And we need to make sure that we are being wise about things that are going on in our government. But to say that the church is like, and its leaders are all big time anti-Trump 100% would be crazy. On the other hand, I think they are rightly concerned about Trump's moral character. And I think they are rightly concerned because that is important in our leaders. But I also think that they are very, very pleased with many of his policies. In fact, you have them with Donald Trump meeting with them at Welfare Square. So it's True. Not, I think we got to be very, very careful before we start saying the church is one way or another. I think the church tries to stay out of the political realm for pragmatic reasons.
Well, just remember, the church did release an editorial in the Deseret News in 2016 that called for Trump to pull out of the race. And I know that's only an editorial, but still it did appear in the Deseret News. And of course, the church, it needs to maintain tax exempt status. So therefore, it cannot directly endorse candidates or political parties in general. Otherwise, could potentially lose its tax-exempt status as the church, and Ensign Peak Advisors as a 501(c)(3). I just want to make one last note before I get your final takeaway on this, Jacob, and that's that we didn't see these kind of warnings from the first presidency against one-party politics back when Mitt Romney was running for president in 2008 and 2012. So I find the timing of this particular, I find it a little bit remarkable that now we're seeing the warnings. I don't know, maybe I'm just reading things in the tea leaves. I don't know.
So I think that back in when Mitt Romney was running, for instance, that the church was in the political landscape was totally different at that time. Our country's more divided now than maybe it ever has been, with the exception of the Civil War. And so when you're dealing with that level of political division, and social division, I think the church is rightly commenting now when things are the way that they are. I don't think it's some big plot, although I'm sure the church was, would have seen having Mitt Romney in the White House as being an ally for the church. And I think with somebody like Donald Trump, I think they have very much more mixed feelings. Although I would say if the church, when it comes to things like abortion and stuff, and they look at the at the Democrats and people like Joe Biden, I think that there's going to be even more concerns on matters that I think, in my opinion, are far more important, especially on a moral level. So I think that the church doesn't have some candidate that they are endorsing. The church is politically neutral, but I do think the church does want for its members in this current climate to try and reduce the divisions as much as they can and try to be wise in who they vote for, because the stakes are very high right now in the powder keg of our society.
That's really good thoughts. And that does take us to our featured news article. We want to spend a few minutes on this featured news article, which I personally found to be the most important news article of the week. And perhaps this is where we might find our widest level of disagreement. We shall see. Now, this is from the Sydney Morning Herald here, and this was released on July 10th, 2023. And for those of you who are not familiar, the Sydney Morning Herald is basically the New York Times of Australia. It's the most reputable news outlet, and it does investigative journalism. The title of the article is "Mormons Walk Away from Major Multinational Tax Evasion Scheme." I just want to read this first sentence here and get your initial takes on this, because we're going to read a couple of passages from this and get your thoughts here, Jacob. "The Mormon Church is significantly reducing its use of a controversial shell company after an investigation revealed that it had engaged in alleged serious tax evasion in Australia." What's your initial thoughts on this so far?
My initial thoughts is I hope the church does whatever it can to reduce its tax exposure and any sort of tax liability for itself or its members.
Okay. What I think is important for me to note is that, and I didn't realize it until I read this article, is that the Ensign Peak shell companies, the 13 shell companies, that's not the only shell companies that the church utilizes. Because LDS Charities Australia was also a shell company. And I do wonder what other shell company that the church currently operates. And this Sydney Morning Herald article for me basically confirmed what the Widows Might leaked this information about a week and a half ago. And they reported on this, and that's only through leaks. And now it's been followed up by more serious journalism. And what the Widows Might report said is that the seriously reducing is an interesting term here, because according to the Widows Might report, the church basically stopped the controversial tax scheme altogether when the Sydney Morning Herald last year blew the whistle, but opened the door or shined the light on the LDS Charities Australia's controversial tax practices.
Yeah, well, anyone who's dealt with tax strategies, first of all, you're always trying to reduce your tax exposure or burden. Okay, and so the church is going to try, if it has any sort of tax burdens, it needs to try and reduce its risk that the government is going to reach its hands into your tithing donations and take money from that to go and fund wars and abortion and all other kinds of things. So what I would say, though, is I guess in Australia, if I'm not mistaken, in Australia, though, tithing donations are not tax exempt or something like that. Is that correct?
That's a very important point here. Charitable donations to churches in Australia are not inherently tax deductible like they are in the United States. You have to prove that your church engages in a substantial charitable outlay. So that's why the church set up LDS Charities Australia. And the Australian states are not paying tithing directly to the church. They pay it to LDS Charities Australia because churches are not inherently tax-deductible donations. So they're trying to get members to have the tax donations and also the church to enjoy them as well by using the shell company. I hope that answers your question.
And frankly, my take on that is good on the church, because frankly, I'm a big and if the church's relationship to government, as I see it, is pragmatic. Okay, because the bigger question here is should the government be able to go in and take money from the church at all? Like, is it any of the government's business? The money that you are exchanging between you and the church isn't the government's business. It's for the church. And so that's where philosophically, I just, at the very ground level, I am opposed to any government in any way interfering whatsoever in what I decide to give to my church.
Yeah, the government is not interfering. You can give as much money as you want to the church. The question is whether that counts as a tax donation. So, the whole idea of a tax donation is the fact that you're giving money to the church, and that's offsetting what the government already has to do. So we're not talking about interference. We're just talking about, is it a tax deductible donation or not? So, the idea is if I start a church in Australia where I'm the only participant, all of the money goes directly into my car and into my house and has no charitable outlook, the Australian government would take a dim view of that, and that would not count for tax deductible. It would not be a tax deductible donation. So, people can donate as much as they want to me, but it just wouldn't count for a tax donation. So there's no interference. I just want to make sure that point is clear.
But the idea is that it does discourage, well, regardless of the way that what happens when you do that is that because there's an assumption there that the church is not actually a charitable organization, okay? When the church absolutely is. So the members are doing nothing wrong. If anyone is wrong, it is the government of Australia who is out there saying that the church is not a quote unquote charitable organization. And from the very start, you're also dealing with someone who looks at this and says, I think all of this is wrong because the government's basis for taxation with these things is wrong in principle in the way that they're doing this. If a person is not, if I have income that I give to a charitable organization that I'm not using for myself, I should not be taxed on that income. I never realized any benefit out of that income per se, because I'm giving it to the church. I'm giving it to someone else, not to myself, right? And so just on that level, that's the way the law should be. What is the law in Australia? Okay, maybe you're right. Maybe you're 100% right. Maybe the church is like violating the law. But I'm not looking at this from the perspective of what is the law. I'm looking at it from the perspective of what is just. And it's unjust for the government to, I think it's unjust for the government to treat as income money that you never realized a gain on, that you didn't actually get to have for yourself to go spend on your house and your movies or whatever the heck you're doing with your money. And so just philosophically from the start, I just have a problem with that.
I do have a question. So if I just take if I get my monthly check and I just take it down to the Ford dealership and I buy a truck, then the government should have no basis on taxing me for the income because I bought a truck. Is that correct?
Because you ultimately are the one who is, it's your truck, right? You own the truck when you're done with it. Yeah. Then you do. That is a personal gain, and therefore it can be income. But you have to remember also, I'm against income tax. So this is kind of you go way down the road. Basically, the only tax I think that is just is a use tax. That's about the only tax that I can think is just. And I only believe that taxes are legitimately morally used in certain ways. So I'm pretty against taxation, and the church's relationship, I think, to Caesar, as I see it, is the same as mine. We'll be pragmatic, and if Caesar comes and wants our money, we'll do it. But we're trying our best not to empower Caesar. We'd rather empower the kingdom of God.
Yeah, let me read another section from this particular article. It says, in Australia, the church has ensured that donations and tithing, neither of which are tax deductible, are routed through a charitable trust to gain 100% tax deductibility. So that really gets back to the point that you said, that in Australia, churches are not inherent, that their donations, that's different from the United States, are not inherently tax deductible. You have to prove that you're using those donations in Australia in order for your organization to gain the tax exempt status. And that's what the church did starting when that law was passed back in 2012. The church formed immediately the LDS Charities Australia, which is what the saints were paying directly into. And what this article points out is that LDS Charities Australia has no paid staff, and it received $90 million in donations in 2021. And then after this article went in the Sydney Morning Herald last April, those donations fell off a cliff as soon as it came to light. And what this article basically confirms is that the church was funneling money from church headquarters into LDS Charities Australia to gain tax benefits from the Utah side, and then funneling it back to church headquarters to gain tax, basically to, like, I don't want to say double dip, that's not the right term, but to gain the maximum amount of tax blessings as possible. And as soon as that was brought to light, the church immediately stopped doing the practice. And that's why there's a massive tort that was filed by all the Australian saints saying that we paid into LDS charities, assuming that it was a charity and that it was engaged in charitable practices. It has demonstrably not engaged in charitable practices, and that's where the rub is.
Okay. So I would say when you pay your tithing to the church, if you actually have paid your tithes, you've given up all rights to that money 110%. Where the church decides to funnel that money for its own tax strategies or within its stewardship to do whatever it needs to grow the tax, or the tithing base of the church, that's on the leaders to make that call, the ones who have the keys over that. If you're paying your tithing and then you're upset with the way that the church is managing those funds, you never tithed in the first place because you are making an offering to God. Okay. They could take my money into a back room and they could burn it for all I care. And I would show up next month with 10% to give. Okay. I mean, they literally burned the firstlings of the flock in ancient Israel. Tithing is about giving up your rights to the money. In my mind, tithing is about saying to the Lord, you and your kingdom are more valuable to me than this money. Take it and do with it whatever you will. So any saint who's like, well, I thought this was all going to be given out to, handed out in bags of cash to people on the street, and that isn't what happened, or in some other, charitable way that I arbitrarily define as charitable, like, you're wrong as a member if that's your attitude. Okay. So that's just straight up. And then the other one is that the state here is the government is the one who's arbitrarily deciding that the church is not a charity and that what they're doing isn't charitable enough, or it's being funneled to other countries or whatever. And in my mind, it's like, well, I'm not following you. I follow the prophets of God. And if they think that it's a better idea that these funds should be used in another country, that's fine. And if you want to tax people accordingly, if that's your prerogative as a government, but I'm going to think it's unjust, because I think whatever funds you give to the church should be totally tax exempt, and that when members give it to the church should be able to do whatever they want with it. And all of this issue and controversy is being created because of the arbitrary will of the government and the people in power and those bureaucrats. And I don't have a lot of faith in them, but I have a lot more faith with Russell M. Nelson and the Quorum of the 12 and the way that they manage finances versus Caesar.
Yeah, just remember that these saints are not giving money to the church. If you give a donation, you are giving it to LDS Charities Australia. You're not giving money to the church. You're giving money to a shell company. So that's the difference. You said you give it to the church, they can burn it on fire. They were giving it to LDS Charities Australia with the purpose of that being used for humanitarian purposes. You don't have, in the United States, you have goodwill offerings with your donations. It says specifically on the bottom, in fact, they updated it about 6 months ago, that the church has no obligation whatsoever to utilize your donation in any manner. All those boxes that you check, that means nothing. But that's the difference in Australia. You're not giving money to the church. You're giving it to LDS Charities Australia. And that is specifically by law says that you have to be doing charitable work in Australia as the vast majority of the income. The church was bringing in $100 million a year, and they were using almost none of it to charity. That's the difference here between the United States and Australia.
So these weren't tithes that were given by the members then? They had donations, tithing, donations, same thing. Well, no, I thought we were making a distinction between tithing and goodwill donations to a charity, because what was this money that was being donated? Was this money that was being given to LDS charities, or were the members giving were they filling out the little tithing slip, putting tithing on it, giving it to the bishop, and then the bishop was then basically instructed to donate those funds, or whoever is in charge of the funds management was instructed to transfer those funds not to church headquarters in Salt Lake, but to the LDS charities in Australia. I'm not sure how that all worked.
Yeah, your donation goes straight to LDS Charities Australia. You do not pay donations. You do not pay tithing to the church in Australia for the last 9 years. You give it to this organization. And that's what Simon Southerton said what the issue is. He says, one has to hope that this signals the beginning of Australian regulatory authorities taking action in respect to the $40 million rort that the church has been engaged in. So what this allegation says is that the church, because they were not using the LDS Charities Australia in any significant way for humanitarian donations, that they benefited from 10 years of tax forgiveness, approximately $400 million worth of tax forgiveness that they should not have been enabled to use because LDS Charities Australia does not constitute or qualify as a tax-exempt organization. So it's not about burning tithing in the back room. Essentially, the class action says that you were taking advantage of the government and deceiving the government for the tune of $400 million worth of tax advantages that you were not authorized to have. That's the issue.
So the issue was that it wasn't being used for charitable purposes.
Well, it was being used for charitable purposes, and that's what the article says. It says that the church in Australia was using 0.3% of LDS Charities Australia. I got it from the article. 0.3% of LDS Charities donations in Australia went towards humanitarian purposes, which really tracks for what we've seen globally with the church, about that percentage rate of around 1%.
Yeah, but what does the money that the church uses go into if not charitable purposes?
Well, the charitable purposes have to be used in the country of Australia. So the money can be sent back to the United States or back to any other place that the church has. The whole purpose of the Australian tax law is that you get a tax donation because you're using your services in the country of Australia. That has demonstrated.
Do you think though that it's just for a government to say, if you give charity to people in other countries, we're going to tax you. We're going to force you to only give charity to people in our country?
I mean, really, every government has the right to set their own laws, and governments are incentivized.
Yeah, but my question is it just? Is that right?
For Australia, the Australian government to subsidize some charitable outlook in Ghana, and for, let's say that a charity took a lot of donations in Australia and had a massive outlook in Ghana, and it affected no Australians whatsoever, but they're reaping tens of or hundreds of millions of dollars in tax deductions for that. I would say that most governments would have an issue with that. I personally can see where their argument is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, but that's because the government has a priority to place its own citizens over the needs of other people in other lands.
Absolutely.
We in the gospel don't have that. And in fact, I would think that we should encourage governments to allow people to donate to whatever charities they want to throughout the world, because we don't just care about our citizens, we care about the citizens in other countries as well. And so for them to punish people for donating to other charities, we have to remember this. This is where it all comes down to in my mind. Every dollar that the church uses is for humanitarian aid. The building of temples is a form of humanitarian aid if you really believe that temples and temple covenants do good for humanity. In fact, I would argue that the greatest poverty program in the world is the LDS temple program, because when people make and keep covenants in temples, when our missionaries go and teach people to live the laws of the gospel, we actually fight poverty, but we fight it at its roots. So any funds given to the church to further the work of Zion is a charitable humanitarian contribution. Now, a government may disagree with that, but of course they're going to. They have their own agenda. And so I'm opposed to all of this. If you're going to, I think that it's unjust for a government to tell its citizens that they're going to be punished because they give money that will end up benefiting people in other countries. I think that's wrong.
Okay. But since the church knowingly knew what the tax law was, that's the issue here. I honestly, I don't disagree with you. The issue is that the church knew what the laws were in Australia. They created a shell company directly to try to benefit both Salt Lake and the Australian saints and the church in a way that flouted Australian tax law. And that's why this article points out that the Australian Tax Authority or organization, the ATO, is looking at the church's use in here and could ex post facto come in and find the church a la SEC, what happened in the United States, in a similar manner. So what I want to say is we've had four, in my opinion, tax dust-ups in the church in the last year alone. The Canadian tax dust-up, the Australian LDS Charities one. We also had the Marshfield Advisors, which we don't have enough time to go into, but that was in Israel. And we had the SEC in the United States. That's 4 areas in the last year where the church is really pushing the envelope when it comes to reducing its tax burden. Is that a wise course of action?
I'm just mad they got caught. I'm a believer that you have to be pragmatic when it comes to the government. I think that you need to, and just so everyone knows, I'm not an official representative of the church. The IRS agents watching, I do pay my taxes. But I do believe that the thing is I think that the church needs to try and do all that it can to protect the sacred funds donated by members from Caesar. Okay. And now there is truth that we need to be wise about how we do that. I do believe that as a principle, we do want to honor and sustain the laws of the governments that we're working with while trying to, as aggressively as we can, without raising the ire of Caesar, comply with his dictates. Christ had the same, I always look at Christ and his relationship to Caesar. Christ was pragmatic towards Caesar and the way that he operated. And that's the way that his church and kingdom should operate as well, so that they don't end up in a bad situation. So if these are issues, these are strategic errors, I do not see them as moral errors. And for those who have this extreme view in the church that we are to honor and sustain the law in all cases, they must be totally unfamiliar with the history of our church from the time of its inception until 1895, where the number one defining feature of our church was that we didn't obey the laws of the land because we believed that we were following a higher law. Now, all churches are obligated to this. Any Christian denomination, the Christian movement itself places God above the rulers of the world. And it allows for the ruling of the world to happen within, as long as they conform to justice and righteousness. And we oppose laws and governments that abuse people and act unjustly. That should be a given for a Latter-day Saint. And so when I look at all these things that the church has done, have they maybe made some strategic errors? Maybe they have. I don't know. But a lot of this stuff, I don't have a lot of judgment towards the leadership of the church over these matters, because ultimately that's their stewardship. Like, I give my money to the church, and then I allow for the church leaders to manage those funds in according with the spirit that's in them and in accordance with the calling that they have to do that. Do they always get it right? Maybe not. They get things wrong sometimes. I know that Joseph Smith didn't do so well with the Kirtland Safety Society. So, if we can forgive Joseph for that, we can forgive them for any strategic errors that they may have made here. But we have to be careful that we don't place Caesar as the ultimate authority here and say, well, you leaders need to get in line with Caesar, because it creates a dangerous sort of precedent in the church to where suddenly the government has our higher loyalty than the loyalty of our faith. And that is something that Christians throughout Christian history, we're studying Acts right now. If you want to go study the Christian movement, the big question was the relationship of these Christians to the state. And what kind of a kingdom are we establishing here? And is it a threat to the kingdoms of this world? And that's a really interesting whole other conversation to have.
Okay, we got to wrap this one up now. Notice, since I'm the host, I get to spend the most amount of time with my pet peeve articles. So
you're
that's
good.
why
You're good.
just remember, just a couple of other last thoughts. We'll wrap this one up. The church is tax exempt in virtually every country that it operates with, in every municipality in every state. So it's really tax exempt from a vast majority of its holding. But what we've seen is in the various places in which governments do ask the church to pay a small portion, that the church will fight that tooth and nail. Now, you talked about render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Now, remember, Jacob, that famous quote was specifically in answer to the question about whether people should pay tithing, obviously pay taxes, to oppressive governments. Because you said that we shouldn't have a loyalty to oppressive governments, but that was what rendered under Caesar that which is Caesar's. And when he was asked specifically, should we pay taxes? He didn't say, no, hire the best lawyers you can, form fake shell companies, and then pay only the minimum that you possibly can, if required by court order, as a result of massive torts and significant regulatory pressure. No, he just said, render under Caesar that which is Caesar's. I see a bit of a difference.
I don't, because I see that there's a little bit of a difference in the way I interpret that scripture. I see as he said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and render unto God that which is God's. Well, I would ask the question, well, what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God? I'm pretty sure everything belongs to God. And I think what Jesus was trying to do in that instance was that he was giving an answer that a Jew would look at and realize that he had just said that everything belongs to God, but that a Roman would hear and think, oh, he's going to pay his taxes. So he evaded the issue so far as I understand that scripture, but all the same. And even leaders of the church may not share that interpretation. And so, but all the same, I think that render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Remember, Caesar was an oppressive government. He was horrible. Jesus' relationship towards Caesar was pragmatic. He said, look, if they're going to come and take the money from you, cooperate. We're not here to raise the sword against Caesar and to draw ourselves into a violent conflict with the state. We are here to do our best to build the kingdom, given the fact that we are in these conditions where we have to, unfortunately, deal with Caesar and comply with his unfair dictates. And so I think that that's the way I look at it. I hope the church pays the minimum and keeps does everything it can to keep Caesar's greedy, dirty hands out of the money that I give to help build the kingdom of God.
There's a couple of other stories in the scriptures, especially around Jesus and taxes. Let me give you a couple of others here too. Remember the legendary story of Jesus's birth with Mary and Joseph at the inn, when his parents allegedly went to Bethlehem to do what?
Pay
What did they
taxes
go to?
and to be
To pay
registered for the
taxes,
census
right.
to comply with the
Yeah,
law.
so legendary story. Now, I mean, Jesus's parents went on a potentially dangerous journey while Mary was pregnant to make sure that they were 100% above board. They didn't retain legal counsel or form shell companies to obfuscate the law.
Well, those didn't exist back then, too.
Well, all I can say is they lived in a society where they were already in Caesar. All the world can be taxed. They were already paying 50 or 60% of their incomes to taxes in Rome to begin with, even without the census. In contrast, the church operates in a world where it is practically untaxed everywhere. But in the extremely modest areas where they have a small tax liability, they fight Caesar at every turn. This is a contrast between Jesus and Jesus's family. I just continue to see a contrast between what we read in the scriptures with what I see in the church.
I think pragmatically, in the days of Caesar, the penalty was a lot higher than if you didn't comply with Caesar's tax laws. And maybe if those governments said, we're going to come and kill the quorum of the 12 apostles and the prophet, maybe they would take a little bit less risk. But if they can pay a little $5 million fine to protect an additional 15 or 20 million in assets, maybe they'll pay that fine. And I think that's, what? Again, my feeling on it is purely pragmatic. I frame this entirely as Caesar and the kingdom of God. They're in opposition to one another, and we're trying our best to work within the bounds that Caesar will let us get away with. And I think Mary and Joseph, if they had broken the tax laws of Caesar, it would have been pretty stark consequences there. And to be honest, that's kind of what the article is saying. It's like, Caesar, we need to crack down on these Christians. We need to make sure that they pay their dues. And frankly, I'm sorry, I'm on the side of Jesus or Joseph and Mary. I'm not on the side of Caesar. So I don't have too much sympathy for this. My loyalty is to Christ. My loyalty is to the leaders of this church. And frankly, I want any money that I'm donated to the church to be in. I want the government to forget those funds even exist.
Okay, one other tax story from the New Testament here. It's in Matthew chapter 17, where Jesus, remember, he asked his disciples to go and catch a fish, and then they would open up the mouth of the fish, and there would be, I think it was one gospel said 2 or 4 drachmas that would satisfy their tax burdens. So Jesus subjected himself to the rules of the land, as should we. He didn't make it a complicated mess to pay taxes, and he encouraged his disciples to pay their necessary taxes. So Jesus himself said to pay it. His parents paid it. His disciples paid. All of these. There was no fight in any of this, and that's just what I see as a contrast between Jesus's church, who seems to have a very aggressive tax avoidance strategy, which seems to me to be in contrast. I could multiply these examples in the Bible. It seems to be in contrast to what we see in the scriptures.
Yeah, I would just say that I think that what is going on in the scriptures is quite a different scenario because the penalties involved were quite different. And frankly, the more fundamental question here is, what should our relationship be to Caesar? Should we gladly go and pay for his conquest of Gaul, where he'll slay and murder and enslave all sorts of people? Is that what we should gladly? Because that's what that money that Jesus was having them donate was actually being used for. We have to remember that this time the Roman legions were on the march throughout the world, enslaving and killing and oppressing everyone. And Jesus just said, hey, give them money. That's a big problem. But we have to remember this. So why would Jesus do that? The reason Jesus did it was purely pragmatic. It's because at the end of the day, if you don't give Caesar, if someone points a gun at your head and says, give me the money, you give them the money. Even if they're a bad person, you don't just take the bullet in the head if that's going to leave your family destitute. And so I've always viewed that the number one thing that I see when I think about the gospel and its relationship to government is that it is a pragmatic relationship. When the government does good, we're in favor of it. When the government does evil, we oppose it. When it comes to taxation, we try to hold on to what we have because we believe that those funds are sacred and that we can use them better than can Caesar. And so I don't fundamentally see any issue. What I see is pragmatic differences. And so this isn't even a moral issue for me. It's purely a strategic, pragmatic issue that I leave essentially entirely in the hands of the brethren so that they can manage the funds of the church.
I promise I'm almost done. I've just got one last point to get through. Okay. And I was just thinking about this article, and it's because of the clandestine nature of the presiding bishopric and the quorum of the 15's personal lives. It's almost impossible for me to evaluate their personal behavior, because some vague general conference anecdotes and occasional highly curated personal stories in the Liahona, I don't get much from that. I don't have any personal interaction with the senior leaders of the church. They don't come to my stake, they don't come to my ward, and they don't come over for me for dinner. So I can't evaluate them on a personal level, except for, like I said, those highly curated situations. However, we continue to learn very valuable information regarding the ethics of the senior leaders of the church in the corporate sphere. And this particular article, for instance, is an example that the more that I learn, the less inspired I become.
Yeah, I don't share that, because I think that in fact, the more our leaders resist funding the conquest of Gaul and Babylon and the works of corrupt governments and states, the more I'm like, right on, guys, like keep going. And I hope that every Latter-day Saint will try to hold on to as much as they can. We all, by the way, try and minimize our tax burden. We all try and do that within the rules, and we all push it as far as we can, even in the gray areas, to the degree that we think we can, that it's justifiable, right? And that is a gray area in and of itself. But the reason that you want to hold on to those funds is because you think you can use those funds better than can Caesar and the government. If you didn't, then you'd give them voluntarily. So at the end, as I look at all of this, and the ethics of the leaders, I made a video on my channel. I encourage everyone to go watch it, about the church's finances. D. Michael Quinn, who is excommunicated from the church, probably gave the most powerful testimony I've ever heard of the church's finances after he was excommunicated. He was talking with the Salt Lake Tribune, or I think we're trying to really get him to rip on the church. And instead what he did was he said that the leaders of the church have access to almost unimaginable funds, and they only take a small stipend that probably is in accordance with that of a mid-level high school administrator in California. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Agreed.
And these men do unimaginable amounts of not religious work, secular work within the church, managing universities, massive logistics operations, all of these kinds of things. And so when it comes to their personal character in relation to these things, that's one of the like big things in my testimony list, is that these men show immense restraint and are able to avoid utilizing these funds for things that are not ultimately dedicated to the benefit, as D. Michael Quinn said, of the rank and file members. And what rank and file members get almost all of this money? They're the rank and file members in places like Africa, the Philippines, and the other areas where the church is trying to develop. Right now, the church is in a bit of a predicament, because the church knows that its North American membership, which provides essentially all the tithing money for the church of any significant quantity, and they're growing fast outside in places like Africa and the Philippines, where there isn't a lot of money coming in, and so it's created this savings account that can continue to fund the work of the church internationally. And so I have a giant testimony of both the brethren when it comes to their personal access to these funds and how much self-control they use, and how they pay church employees twice what they make.
True.
And then on the other hand, and also how these funds are ultimately used for whose benefit? For our benefit, and to build the kingdom. And so anytime the government is getting in to mess with that, I'm just like, I don't like it.
Let me give you one last question, and this is my final question for you, Jacob, and that's, should I follow the church's same ethically questionable tax avoidance approach in either my own individual life or in the small businesses that I run? Should I follow this church's approach here?
I wouldn't say it's unethical to do all that you can to minimize tax burdens upon you, because I trust you with your money more than I trust Caesar. And so I think Latter-day Saints should, within the bounds of the law, minimize their tax burdens to the greatest degree possible. And I think, but they also need to be very wise about how they do this. And maybe the church has been unwise. I'm not saying that. If the church has been unwise, they've been unwise, and maybe they've done some things but I'm going to leave that to their judgment. But be wise, because you're dealing with Caesar. If Caesar tells you to go and register for the tax, and you got to take your wife on a donkey to do it to avoid being put to death, then you do it. And Caesar has a lot of power. And so I don't advise people to do stupid tax things ideologically, because Jesus understood the consequences of that, and you'll find out the consequences of that. So Do your best to comply with the tax laws while at the same time minimizing your tax burden, because I trust you with your money more than I trust the government.
Well, Jacob, we have accomplished virtually the impossible considering your YouTube video channel and how, shall we say, dynamic your normal interactions are. This has been relatively sedate.
Well, thanks. You're a gracious host, though, Dive. You're easy to talk to and get along with. Thank you.
I have accomplished what Jim Bennett and Steve Heinecker failed to do. So I guess I'll just put that into my feather in my cap there. I gotta boast on something. That's a pride cycle. So I've got to be right on the top of the pride cycle. Now, Jacob, we drop these episodes live on YouTube Sundays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you show up on my YouTube channel, you will be able to interact with the live chat then. And I just want to give a shout out. Our episode's music is brought to us by Weird Alma on Bandcamp.com. And thanks so much for ruminating with me on the Great Spacious Beehive. And remember, no unhallowed hand can stop this podcast from progressing. So long.
When it comes to nicknames of the church, such as LDS Church, the Mormon Church, to remove the Lord's name from the Lord's church is a major victory for Satan.
Satan.